Well, welcome, SAF students, faculty, guests. This is our second Center for Sustainability Reporting and Performance Management in Practice event this fall. My name's Adam Presley. I'm joined today by my colleague and co-host of these events, Nancy Vandenbosch. Hi, Nancy.
Hello, Adam. Hello, all.
And we are super excited. I know I am, to be joined today by Myuran Raventhiran. Myuran is the manager of performance management at Metrolinx for PRESTO. Myuran is a CPA back in the CA generation, graduated from SAF's MAC program in 2013. Thanks so much, Myuran, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Hey, Myuran, where were you born and raised?
Yeah, I was born in the exotic Mississauga, Ontario. That's where I grew up. And then obviously came over to Waterloo for university.
Didn't travel too far then. So you're a kid in the Mississauga area. I assume you said, I'm going to go work at PRESTO, Metrolinx when I want to be older, when
Absolutely.
I grow up. Is that, or what do you remember when you were a kid, what you wanted to be when you grew up, and maybe when you were in the AFM or the MAC program here at SAF?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. Still feel like figuring that out. But no, I remember when I was a kid, I loved the idea of being like a documentary filmmaker, because it would be a great excuse to travel and be kind of just hear and tell stories, because I loved just like I sucked up stories like just a vacuum. I was a kid, loved reading, and I felt like that was just a cheat code to getting to do that. So obviously, the SAF was a very different place to end up, but what I liked, well, the reason I even was interested in CPA was just having that kind of stability, but also just the idea that every organization ever is going to need either CPA or somebody in accounting or finance to help make those either strategic decisions, help inform leadership, help be leadership, whatever. You can go anywhere, and that was that ability to be a chameleon in like any organization was super appealing, and that's the flexibility that I was really interested in when I kind of went the CPA route, and it's true, like it did kind of happen. I've worked in Europe and in Africa here. I've worked at like you're saying, like a large NFPO, NFP right now. I've worked at a law firm. I've worked at a medical tech startup. I've worked at kind of a private equity run security monitoring firm. So you can literally go anywhere. So that's why I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up, basically.
So can you help us or walk us through some of those major milestones? So you graduated the MAC program in 2013. And like you just sort of laid out briefly, you had a pretty wild career path to find yourself in your current role. Can you talk a bit more about some of those milestones on your way to Metrolinx?
Yeah, 100%. I'll start off by saying the general theme is like organizations tend to take on kind of the personality of what they sell. It's something that I've sort of learned over time. Maybe it's blindingly obvious to some, but sometimes you learn best by experience. So then when I was at the SAF, I had actually gotten my co-op terms at MNP. Well, first time I was at the SAF. So Nancy and Adam were my coworkers, along with some of your other profs. But from there, I started at MNP. So this was back under the old CPA program where you had to get your audit hours and do all that. So they owned you for the first however many months it was. But that was a great experience. So it was like a lot of skill sets built. It was a lot of exposure to a lot of different types of organizations. So it's MNP at the time. I don't know what they're like now in terms of, obviously they've grown tremendously, but they were different from, say, the Big Four, where there was a huge variety of organizations that they served. So during that time there, I had exposure to, publicly listed companies, manufacturing, not-for-profits, nursing homes, everything. And nothing was really virtual those days. You're out there literally like sitting sometimes in darkly lit basements, sometimes in fancy boardrooms, working on things. And then from there, like I love the idea of being that generalist, and I think that's a theme that's kind of paid off a little bit, or at least held consistent over my career. And so building that sort of skill set, I think, helped me jive well with some of the partners there. So once I graduated, completed the UFI, got the CPA, very shortly after that, I was very interested in kind of, stepping away from audit, doing something that I felt was maybe more interesting, maybe felt more value add in my mind. And from there, I ended up on a consulting engagement out in Botswana. And so that was a switch out of audit. I was excited. I was there for like 6 months or something like that. And it was like basically, if you imagine your Service Ontario, you log on, you're trying to renew your license, trying to get a business license, whatever it is, it's kind of that equivalent in Botswana. So that was a very cool project, completely out of audit. And then from there, that gave me kind of the credibility at M&P to switch over to consulting. And from there, it leveraged those CPA skills to go into enterprise risk services. So that's really your internal controls, go, no-go decisions, strategic analysis and things like that. So it's super interesting, a lot of focus on internal controls, but even from there, a chance to travel a lot and like see different organizations. And then, when it was time when I felt like I really wanted to kind of get out there and help build something for real, that was when I made the leap. And I felt like what fit maybe what I wanted the most was this medical tech startup. So I was at this organization called Synaptive Medical. We're still around today, of course. But they were working on really innovative, kind of made in Canada equipment to help out with brain surgery. And so honestly, it was like working at the coolest place ever, somewhere in Toronto. I didn't see a piece of paper for the entire time I was there. Let's just put it that way. Which now it doesn't sound like a big deal, but still, it was a very interesting experience. But I learned a lot at that organization, and it was really building their financial reporting team. So it was going for them as a senior financial analyst, like helping out. They used to close their books like once a year. They struggled with their audit. They didn't have internal controls. They were burning through cash very quickly. It was very interesting, and it was a very welcoming culture. And so from there, I got to like try to prod and make all those changes. And then I guess kind of the next move from there was just kind of growing into management. And so this opportunity came up at this law firm, McCarthy Tétrault, so one of the largest law firms in Canada. Very cool. They were doing a complete rebuild. And I think this is a theme. A lot of folks on the call obviously have been through their co-op terms. But if any of you have been kind of at even bigger organizations, a recurring theme you'll find is things are held together with duct tape, right? And they're barely holding on. McCarthy Tétrault, like many law firms, is like it's old, literally like 100 years old or more. But they were doing a complete rebuild of their finance function, and that happens all the time at so many different organizations. So that was a chance to again rebuild a financial reporting team. I had a great director whom I reported into and learned a lot about kind of leadership from her, learned a lot of skills from her, and then I also had a chance to build up the financial planning and analysis function. And so in trying to bring this and tie this, I guess, back to performance management, it's hard to just start off right in performance management, at least from my perspective in the role that I'm doing. You really got to build that kind of generalist and like well-rounded kind of view. And so going from your financial reporting sort of very much focusing on past oriented results and like analyzing the present state to financial planning and analysis where I'm helping them budget and forecast, then you're getting a little bit closer to another kind of theme to highlight, like really knowing what a business sells and what they do. And that is obviously at the law firm, legal services. And so understanding that, looking at building the business acumen to understand drivers and building that relationship with folks who own the business, that was super interesting. And so I think that was like a big learning adjustment for me. It was a very different environment from, say, a startup environment. It was very much super professional. People dressed up way nicer than I was used to, et cetera, et cetera. Wasn't anything like Suits, before anybody asks. The egos were even bigger. But regardless, super interesting time. I was there for almost 3 years. And then just around the start of the pandemic, I switched over to this private equity kind of organization called Stealth Monitoring. And what they do is provide basically camera monitoring services for two streams of business, kind of mobile monitoring for construction sites, which are constantly changing, and then your fixed kind of monitoring, which is say a strip mall or a residential building. Nothing's changing. You're monitoring it. You're providing those services, and super interesting, very fast paced. They literally doubled in size during the time that I was there. But I think again, the same themes apply. It was very much focused private equity funded, and so hyper focus on the bottom line and every single decision is going through this lens of the return on invested capital, everything from, moving your office building to moving where our monitoring center is on the other side of the world to switching out equipment that's at certain sites to refurbish them and reuse them. Everything is through that lens, which is very much a focusing factor, and very interesting to think about because you really kind of get into the heads of the folks who are funding these types of organizations. And again, a lot of learning there. And from there, I think kind of got tired of forgetting what my family looked like because it's hard to downplay the amount of work that goes into it, but it's again super interesting, super rewarding. And then from there, what I came across was this role at Metrolinx, which I saw and felt was pretty unique in performance management. And where I sit now is kind of bringing it all together, which is there's all these teams, and I think in finance there's so many different types of minds, skill sets, types of work. It's tough because it's like saying, you work in medicine and it's not very specific, right? So there's so many kinds of medical professionals. I think feel like a lot of people, I'm sure everybody on this call has experienced this when somebody thinks you just do taxes if you're in accounting, right? And so this role really brings all the different kinds of minds together, and I'm kind of helping be the nexus of all that. And so it's been kind of a culmination indirectly of that, while feeling like I'm contributing to, like a public sector type scenario where actually adding social goods. So yeah, that's kind of a lengthy overview.
Absolutely. So we've followed Myuran to Metrolinx, and now we probably think of Metrolinx as GO trains. At least I do, and I'm not from the Toronto area, so for me, it's the GO trains and the buses. But I was telling Nancy earlier, spent a fascinating afternoon learning about the breadth of offerings. So it also includes the Express and Presto. Can you help us understand the mission and the scope of Metrolinx? And then maybe more specifically, the Presto area that you spend much of your time in.
Yeah, for sure. So Presto, I guess, going all the way back, is kind of born from this vision of this better connected Ontario, and really facilitating that public transit, facilitating healthy kind of communities all over the place. It's a very lofty thing, which as most missions are, and so making that practical. Metrolinx is kind of serving as this regional integrator of transit. And as you say, like there's a lot of places where, where transit especially is very municipal focused, and that interconnectedness isn't necessarily there. And I think in my mind, at least, Metrolinx especially kind of covers that for at least the province of Ontario. And you covered, the key facets. So the GO train and bus, the UP Express, and then there's Presto, which they're trying to rebrand to Payments now, Payments Presto in brackets, which essentially is the facilitator between all of those things and the transit agencies, right? And I think, it's tough to think about it. It's such a huge organization, and as I'm sure, in any of your courses, you learn about silos in organizations, and that can be a challenge. And it's been at literally every organization I've ever been at. There are silos. But what's interesting here is when sometimes some of these different divisions can have to kind of negotiate and work together, right? There's all sorts of interactions where Metrolinx is also the facilitator between other transit agencies, right? So Metrolinx actually serves you think of yourself as a Presto customer. Yes, you are. But Presto's other customers, or I would argue like the real business line, is serving these transit agencies. So GO and UP are customers of Payments, Presto, and the TTC is our customer, and not Waterloo region, but 10 other transit agencies from Mississauga to even Ottawa, to Burlington, Hamilton, etc. They're all our customers. We have relationships with them where, they pay us commission for facilitating that payment. And so it's very unique. You've got an organization that partly, manages stations and like old school brick and mortar, big construction, big visible projects that look maybe too shiny for the communities they're in. They're just kind of out of place. It's something from like 2040. 2040 is too close. Maybe 3000. But then you have Presto, which is more of almost like a financial technology company, which is facilitating payments, facilitating innovation on how people pay, as slow as it is to come. The ability to tap with your credit card, the ability to pay with your mobile wallet like Apple and Google wallets, the ability to just buy e-tickets instead of using your Presto card, and what that means for the customer, and what that means for equity. So that's something that, touching on what's different at a not for profit, that never entered the conversation before, right? So when I was at, say, that private equity funded organization, it's like everything is from the return on invested capital. Well, I mean, news is, Metrolinx and Presto are always trying to just reduce the subsidy that they get from the government, where, that it's up there. It's very important, but there's so much that we have to do in order to make sure that access and equity needs are met and human rights are met. And so it's a very interesting blended mission.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic transition to my next question, because you nicely laid out the breadth of customers, but to the extent, and you already mentioned a few other stakeholders, but it's a crown agency, and so it reports to the Minister of Transportation of Ontario and receives 3 levels of government funding. And so, can you help us understand some of the key stakeholders? You've mentioned customers, but beyond that, some of the key stakeholders. And then this is the part I think that touches on a lot of our course is how do you measure those stakeholders' satisfaction? How do you know they're happy with what you're doing?
Right. Yeah. No, it's a tricky subject. There's this entire department dedicated to it. It's a mix of so many things. So I think, like, you've got your riders. That's one stakeholder, no doubt. You've got your transit agencies, which are a massive stakeholder. You've got also the communities that it operates in, right? And so every so often, you'll see it in the news, like whether it be Metrolinx or Going Up or whatnot, like trying to work with communities to make things happen, dealing with challenges that come with that. You've also got the MTO and the reporting to them. So I think it's like the most cut and dry is maybe the relationship with the MTO, and yet not really, where you've got financial reporting that makes sense. You've got your results. You've also, you're trying to show value for that funding. You're trying to show value, and that value isn't necessarily that you're raking in millions of dollars. It's maybe what have you done, and to actually facilitate that mission. And same deal with riders. The customer satisfaction score is a massive driver. So that's maybe, if I pair that with the ridership, that's something that our teams focus on. If you pair that with for the transit agencies, it's probably the level of adoption to an extent of Presto payments products. Now that becomes hard when at some point, almost everybody's using Presto, except for those who use cash and need to use cash because they're either underbanked or not able to, invest in something like Presto, which is an investment for folks. That's the kind of thinking that we need to apply, right? What does that mean? So it's a tricky question. I think it really does come down to which stakeholder you're talking about, and also how measurable something is, right? All sorts of work that we do, all sorts of funding that we might request. There's all sorts of intangible benefits that become so difficult to measure, whether it be improved ease of access. How do you measure that? Is it just by ridership going up? That might not be because of your initiative, or it might have happened anyway, but is it the right folks that we're trying to help, or now having easier access? Yeah, it's very, there's a mix of like folks who look 20, 30, 40 years in the future at Metrolinx, and there's a mix of also folks who literally look at the next fiscal year, the next 5 years. And those sides eventually align on some metrics, but it is a challenge.
That's fascinating. And I could see the challenge is at some point trying to bring that challenging world all together,
right,
and allow that to inform decisions.
At sort of Metrolinx Presto, can you describe maybe a couple of the control processes that have been introduced?
Yeah, for sure. I guess would love to narrow it down, but I mean, I'll make an assumption in case I can't. So in terms of control processes, I mean, for a group of folks from the SAF, I think from financial control perspective, they're very mature on, as you can imagine, as a public sector entity on that front. If you're talking, fundamental like cash control, our expenses and vendor management processes are very robust, sometimes, way less flexible, as you can imagine, than a private sector organization. where you've got a process with vendors of record, you've got massive procurement, which is another theme I want to touch on. So we'll circle back to the procurement bit. So that's kind of the straightforward spending side. You've got all sorts of KPIs and controls in place that are monitored on dashboards at the executive leadership level. Everything from diversity in leadership to levels of customer satisfaction, obviously, to immediate fiscal performance in that year, to uptake on key initiatives that they're keeping an eye on, right? So that level of control flows down to folks. And then one thing that I have to mention is the huge focus on safety, right? So this is where I'm saying an organization takes on the personality of what it sells. Every meeting, like every big meeting at Metrolinx, really starts with a safety moment, right? So where, if we even in the finance team, like no joke, when we have our weekly meetings, we're catching up on the weekend, and then also like, somebody will share their safety moment of kids going back to school. Be careful when you drive, right? So that is not necessarily a control, but it's a culture piece that fits into how we approach everything.
What are the challenges you encountered at Metrolinx? So what was it the change in the corporation's structure, systems? What were some of the challenges when you started there?
Yeah, for sure. So I think especially in the role that I'm in, performance management. So it exists as a nexus of a lot of things. So you got to speak a lot of different languages. And so that's something that I've always sort of enjoyed, is trying to bring people together and make these two different sides talk, let's say. But usually there's like 5 different sides. And one thing that's different here is a lot of my work is sometimes strategic decision support, right? As an example, where we're trying to make a very pointed, specific, strategic financial decision, like do we shut down this piece of software right now, right? Do we roll out this extra way for people to load their cards, and do we keep it going? And to answer those questions, you need a lot of things. You need people's time who are actually close to it in the business. You need data. And I think one thing that I'll focus on for this one is the level of data, or the data that I need to make that decision. So a lot of times you're left working with folks to take your best guess. And that's I mean, I think if you've been in the workplace, even on co-op terms, what you realize is nobody really knows what they're doing. And performance management is someone like turning a whole bunch of people who don't know what they're doing to taking their best assumptions and their knowledge and turning it into the best educated guess that you can take at that time, with full assumptions laid out, with logical, internally consistent thinking. And so I think getting folks to think about problems in that way, where we approach it with a finance bias. There's other impacts. There's been plenty of times when I've been against a project because I've looked at it on the face of it and said, this is like, we're losing $2 for every $1 we put in. Why are we doing this? And then by doing a deep dive, you understand the other implications that come with it, what it enables. And so I think getting your head around that, especially the leap from having worked in for-profit organizations for my entire life to now, is one big deal, one big challenge. And then also getting that information to the extent where, Metrolinx is doing a big push, and a lot of organizations are, to try and build a data lake and try to build, a lot of that big data type analysis and building that infrastructure. And it starts, from the top. You'll hear garbage in, garbage out. You've definitely heard that in your courses. And that's a massive challenge at, again, every organization I've ever been at. And so I think that's a challenge for everyone. And that's probably the one I'd leave you with for that one.
Okay. A couple more questions, Adam, then I'll turn it back to you. So a couple of questions here from sort of Zexon and Yolanda, sort of looking for maybe an example, and I'll use Yolanda's. If you think about those broader organizational objectives, can you talk a little bit about the process to try and ensure that people are focused on the objectives and carry them out? So you can talk a little bit about, how they're set, and then how you get information and manage the delivery of the service for those objectives.
Right. Yeah. Very broad question. I'd go back to what Professor Grant Russell used to say. What gets measured gets managed, and it's very true. So I think there's a lot of key initiatives that are going on, and I touched on procurement earlier. So you may not know, or you might know, like Presto Payments is in the process of re-procuring from the vendor that provides us now all the things that make Presto Presto. Everything from fare cards to the machines you tap on to the software in the back end, which is, obviously very complicated and a big deal. And so, that's, say, a key initiative. And so if from the perspective of what gets measured gets managed, usually it starts with steercos and leadership, and working alongside stakeholders like finance, like the business, to establish what are our indicators of success, having the data flows to make sure we're monitoring that as things go on, and then also centering that in day-to-day work. And so usually what we're trying to do when there's a big piece like that is you're trying to wrap that into people's individual performance management plans. So, every year when folks are setting their own goals for their own growth, you want to align that with your KPIs, with your strategic plan, and your key deliverables. And so that internal alignment is something that I've seen a pretty good focus on here. And really that enables people to not only focus on those priorities, but have it justify that they're focused on those priorities. Oftentimes it's like, this is a big deal for the organization, but in my role, I'm only caring about one thing that maybe doesn't have to do with it. And so when that mismatch happens, that creates a lot of challenge. So I think that individual focus, or the inverted pyramid from like the organizational to the individual focus, is a big deal. And that messaging is the key.
You're someone who works with, numbers and finances. Would you get involved in decision-making around safety measures? Like how much of a say would you have in decisions that might affect the safety of customers?
Finally, I can say not my department, but obviously it's super, super important. I would contest the first part of the question though, where, people say, people in accounting deal with numbers, but I think we just deal with feelings most of the time, to be honest. And I think people who, everybody on this call, like you said, has been on a co-op term. I think numbers are fine. We can all do them. I think what differentiates us in our careers is how we deal with people and feelings and communicating that story. And so, but that's just a rant. But yeah, thankfully, nobody in accounting is in charge of safety. So I'll just say that. But we obviously it's part of the culture. So it's something we talk about. It's for the closest maybe I would deal with it is if there's some initiative that we need to make a strategic decision on that could have finance implications, et cetera. But at the end of the day, safety is the top priority. So.
Now, I want to turn or come back to something you said earlier about the challenges when it comes to measuring and monitoring some of the non-financial outcomes. Can you speak to, say, in terms of budgeting or planning, what are some of the more trickier estimates or predictions or assumptions that you find yourself dealing with or struggling with?
Yeah, for sure. So it's interesting. This might be, help make it more practical for folks too. So in Presto, like I said, there's several businesses within Metrolinx and payments. Presto is, at the end of the day, I think of us like a technology company, right? And yet, if you were to say, hey, you've asked somebody on the street, what does Metrolinx do? We're a transportation company, right? So when we're doing our annual budgeting and forecasting, if you think, so our business model, again, for those on the call who maybe aren't as familiar, which I suspect might be many, is when you put money on your Presto card and you tap and you use, say, the TTC or Mississauga Transit or whatnot, you pay your fare, but then you pay a reduced Presto price for using your Presto card, and then we'll get a commission of a percentage of that. And so for our business, the revenue line is made up of the number of people who use Presto card to travel and which agencies they travel on. And yet, we're not selling bus rides or train rides. I mean, we sell Presto cards and, obviously there's some revenue attributed to that, but that's not the core of our revenue. It's commission revenue, right? And so the centerpiece of the forecasting team's challenge is, how do you predict ridership for agencies that we are not, right? There's 11 transit agencies. They behave surprisingly differently, and every year, and you're trying to figure out, and it's all well and good when it's quote unquote normal times, but ever since March 2020, There is no cyclical nature. We're maybe sort of seeing cyclical natures in ridership now, but it's like every month you're trying to figure out what is going on. Some are some transit agencies have returned to higher than ridership before. Some are still at 50%, 20%. It's crazy. So that I think is a challenge that I'd center on. It's like, how do you literally predict the activities of everyone in Ontario and how they're feeling and what lockdowns are going to do, what vaccine rates are going to do. Yeah, it's quite a challenge for the team.
We talk about in class how to set targets, and we talk about, well, there's some smart ways, and then a traditionally more dumb way is just do what we did last year. It sounds like the naive or the dumb way just isn't an option in this situation. There's just too much change, too much volatility. That's just fascinating. Nancy, I'll turn it back over to you.
Can you walk us through an example that may be a little bit more focused on making sure operations are efficient?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I can think of, and I mean, it's tough because it's not there's a combination of things. You can think about controls as something that routinely happens perpetually, and then there's also the attitude and the approach. So at Metrolinx, there's been a big push on lean training, and that kind of methodology and applying things like A3s and things like that, and to really streamline and create savings where we can. And savings doesn't mean dollars, right? It can also mean time. It can also mean efficiency, like the point of this question. And so that kind of philosophy is something they're trying to really permeate throughout the organization. And cultural change is super hard. And so I think one example, there's a couple from recent times. I think one example is our discussions around right now. When you go into certain retailers, you can load your Presto card there. Now, there's never been a performance management kind of lens put on that. So at some retailers, you see that a lot of people load their Presto card. And you see there's a lot of sales of Presto cards. And then at other retailers or other locations, you'll see that for the past year, like nobody's loaded their Presto card. And so that's not a metric, that's not a KPI that's anywhere. This goes to my cultural point of management controls, where we're raising that control. Like what should there be? Should there be some sort of performance management metric where we say, hey, like if this is an underperforming area, how do we rearrange our resources? So it's not like we're going to make more money, but we're going to lose less. It's we're avoiding that cost, especially if maybe we want to grow into a different area and another retailer wants it. It costs us money to have the devices and the infrastructure there for you to go load your Presto card. So instead of buying something new, can we repurpose? And if so, how do we measure that, and how do we make that a sustainable program? So that's an example of something I'm working on right now, where what's our decision-making framework? Who gets to decide? What's the order of how things happen to say, hey, this is underperforming. Okay, yes, it is. Oh, you want a new store? Well, within our contract, what can we do, and can we save costs? So there's two things. There's that routine, and then there's that attitude, that philosophy that creates the routine. And so that's an example of something, hopefully, where we're kind of giving birth to a management control.
Well, and I know a little bit about Adam's course, and I know he focuses a lot on cultural controls. So definitely feel free to pull some of the cultural examples in. I've got a couple of questions, but I want to ask a follow-on question of what you just talked about, because there may be more students out there who don't have a good understanding of it. Just wondering how that lean training then would actually help achieve the organizational objectives. So can you talk just briefly about lean and how it works?
Sure, yeah. So practically, like how Metrolinx is rolling it out is literally, mandatory in-depth lean training for everyone, like almost everyone across the board, where it makes sense. And so I think traditionally, when you think of lean training, you think very much of physical processes, things on the factory floor, things in manufacturing. What this does, though, by having everybody kind of involved, you have everybody looking at, the core of our business, which still is, bus and rail. And then you also have that philosophy being justified and backed up by the organization, that cultural change. And you have lean filtered through, like I was saying earlier, onto people's goals. And so lean goals and outcomes are literally in all our performance plans. And so what that does is really help folks justify the time that they're going to spend on it. And there's an encouragement to showcase what are your lean wins. And they could be small, they could be big, and in between.
Wondering about motivation or encouraging employees to meet performance expectations. What are some of the initiatives or practices that are in place to come back to the people comment you made?
Yeah, it's that's an interesting one. It's not necessarily something I'm deeply involved in, but I think culturally, I think it's it comes down to leadership as well, right? So I think to a certain extent, you can tie things to people's pay, you can tie things to, something sort of tangible. But I think the other cultural piece too, especially at Metrolinx, I find is a lot of folks who are here or who join are oftentimes, pretty passionate about this kind of thing or very interested in it. So you have that intrinsic motivation. I think what helps is a lot of the times that recognition across the board. So even just shout outs, call outs, that kind of, peer-to-peer recognition really helps build the connections, and B, that feeling of reward and something very intangible that helps drive people to continue to make those changes. It's because it's easy to say like, okay, like we'll tie a bonus to it. It's easy to say, well, your performance metrics with respect to it, but not everything that we do in finance necessarily. If you want to bear it, limit it to a lens of, okay, how do you motivate, say, a finance team? Like it's not like we're making widgets all the time, right? Unless maybe you're in like transaction processing, which maybe is not the topic of the conversation. So yeah, you have to really work to people's kind of intrinsic motivations.
And I'd like to sort of bring it back into a bit of more of a high level question, because you've had such great experience working for-profit organizations, and now you're working in a not-for-profit space. I was wondering if you could help the students and I understand some of the key differences or distinctions that you see. And I think you've mentioned some in our conversation earlier, but is there something that stands out to you in terms of your experience as well as the operations that sort of differentiates these two spaces?
Definitely. So yeah, so I'd say the majority obviously has been in for-profit, and then in terms of the not-for-profit space, I've done it from a volunteer perspective, being a board member on my own time, and then as well as obviously at the Metrolinx professionally. And so I'd say I think what's been the most refreshing is that ability to really look at, in Metrolinx's example, like something other than the ROIC, obviously. And then you've got, return on investment. And so you've got that equity angle, which was, I have like clear memories of the first time where, within the first little while of me joining, because not everybody obviously has a perfect understanding of this kind of thing or thinks about it naturally. But then when you meet somebody who does at an organization like Metrolinx, they're always super passionate about it, and that's been awesome. And a lot of leadership is actually very passionate about it. And so I remember again, like looking at one initiative or another and not really understanding why, something happened. For example, Presto cards, sometimes there's a charge for when you go into a negative balance, right? And a surcharge based on that. And it makes sense, like it's very standard in the payment industry. But then, I literally met somebody who was one of the lead advocates for either removing that. I'm not sure where it is now, but like removing it for a short period of time for that explicit reason of equity, right? And who has the access and who is banked and underbanked and who needs transit. So for example, something that would never see the light of day in, at say, a for-profit organization is at Payments, we were working on a project to help the ability for people to load their Presto cards at public buildings, like say libraries, community centers, blah, blah, blah. Why is that? Like, there's going to be less traffic. You're not going to have as many transactions. And also, why can't people just go on the web? And the reason is for all those reasons. Like, there's people who can't do those things. And they're not your audience when you're in a private sector sort of organization. So I think that's also that's the cool part, but also the curse of it, because it's so hard to measure. Like, there's no way we're going to be able to prove. Like, I had to try and come up with, like, this is the problem I'm faced with. Like, okay, please quantify what's our revenue going to be from this. I'm digging deep into demographic studies and doing calculations, trying to figure out, okay, how many people are going to load now because they're near a library incrementally. You don't know, but you know that it's something that you're trying to provide. And so that's huge. That's very difficult. So the measuring success becomes much harder. A lot of not-for-profit organizations, some are very lucky in that, hey, this is what we do. We, I don't know, crank out free food for people. So it's very easy to measure. Other ones often that have huge impacts, like, what would happen if Metrolinx didn't exist? I don't know, but it's tough to necessarily quantify and measure. And yet we know it needs to happen. So it's a very tricky space to be in, but that's also the rewarding part.
That's just fantastic, and a great transition for the students in the next few weeks as we start encountering some of these challenges. So we've used up all our time with you, but I do want to hit our last question. Do you have any advice that you'd like to share with our students?
Yeah, for sure. So I know a lot of, again, everyone's been on co-op terms. Everyone's seen the working world to an extent. You get back out there soon at some point. I think, I've touched on a couple of those things. If you're staying in finance, get close to revenue if you can, just to help understand. It helps, build your visibility. It helps you really understand the drivers of a business. I think the other thing is really, again, that point of we, manage finances, but we also manage feelings. So I think you've probably seen this in your co-op terms, and you will continuously, like, two folks can join the same organization. They can have wildly different experiences just based on, how they deal with messaging and storytelling, especially in performance management. Like, you can have the best analysis in the world, like, no matter, like, you can go in depth, but then if you can't communicate it, if you can't bring those people onto your side, or if you can't at least strike the balance, it's not always about winning. It's usually about having that even-handed presentation and giving folks the voice that they need while, coming back with the facts of your own or your own persuasive arguments. It's tough. It's feelings management is a massive key. So you have to tailor your communication to who you're talking to. What else can I say? Make friends with IT wherever you go. Number one, it's huge. They'll help you in so many ways. Whether or not you deal with them. I think the fact that everybody on the call will be working hard is a given. Like, you're going to do good work. It's unfortunately the differentiator is, again, how you approach some of these things and how you approach the human side of the discussion. I think one thing that's helped is goes back to that whole wanting to be a documentary filmmaker thing. Like, I think different people find success in different ways. So this is obviously just one small corner of my experience, which is, tiny in the grand scheme of things. But I think I've always found it rewarding to just be genuinely curious about what people do and what makes them tick. It was way easier when we were in the office, but then we also like to commute. So, it's a trade-off. Virtually it's a bit harder, but when you're genuinely curious about what people do, outside of finance and in finance, I've found it very rewarding, and I found it's always opened up opportunities in some way, shape, or form, or just plain made my job easier because I'd have access to information or their perspectives that, took whatever work I was doing to the next level. So, yeah.
Well, that is just fantastic, Myuran. I can't thank you enough for your time, your valuable insights. I want to thank CPA Ontario for funding these events. I want to thank our students. I know that, again, this is a busy time, so thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully, you got as much out of this conversation as I did. It's just fantastic, Myuran.